very warm welcome back to Impact Skills Training Channel. My name is Laith and I'm here to help you get better at communication and leadership skills. So you'll recall at the end of last week we talked about what you see and what you hear and why that is so important, particularly in the online world these days. We are constantly on Zoom calls, WebEx calls, Teams calls, and in what I like to call our 13-inch office. Yes, we are slowly going back to hybrid meetings, even face-to-face in-person meetings, but I still see the vast majority of meetings are still online. So we spoke about what we could see and what we could hear last week. Remember, there were 5 different ways of us absorbing, if you like, consuming information through our senses: what we see, what we hear, what smell, touch, and taste, and so on. So for us in the virtual world, there are only 2 real senses that we can portray, that we can get our message across effectively in an engaging manner. And that really is what we can see and what we can hear. So out of the 5 senses, we're really left with only 2, which is 40% of maximum capacity. So although we spoke about what we can see and what we hear as an introduction, we also spoke much more detail in what we can see. And I said we'll go on to talk about in much more detail, deep dive into what we can hear. That's both you as a presenter, but more importantly, perhaps your audience who are listening to you. How is your message coming across? How do you sound? All right. So let's go into the flip chart and have a look at exactly how we can cut that into little bite-sized chunks. Here we go. So if you recall from last week's chart, I broke down what we could see and what we could hear. So now you can see that we've just singled out what we are listening to. In other words, what can your audience hear? Now, I've put the first one up, of course, volume. Volume is desperately important since what we're listening to has to be audible. That's the very basic fundamentals. If I cannot hear what you as the presenter or the meeting organizer is saying, then not only is it very frustrating to me as an audience member, I might actually be distracted enough to ask my neighbor, what did he say? What did she say? Or I'm tuning in so hard to try and listen to what you're trying to say because the volume is so low. I'm straining and it takes an awful lot of effort to listen to what you're saying. Now, if I'm working really hard as an audience member, not only to listen and absorb and understand what you're saying, just straining to even hear it, I'm working too hard. As a presenter, as somebody who's giving a presentation or speaking or communicating in front of a group of people, small or large, it is your job to ensure that you make life as easy as possible for your audience members to hear you and to follow what you're saying. So the first thing I would say is volume. It's so important. Now, volume is very subjective, isn't it? So on what scale are we talking about? Well, I'm talking right here, right now, at about 7 out of 10. So if you think of a sliding scale, on 1 being so low that you can't hear the person, 10 being obnoxiously loud, unnecessarily so, that it becomes grating and irritating to listen to. So somewhere on a 7, perhaps an 8 of 1 to 10 scale would be about right. Now that volume is your 7 to 8, not my 7 to 8, because different voices have different pitches and they sound different at different volumes. And the best, and I get asked this all the time, so how do I know where my 7 or 8 out of 10 is? The best advice I can give is literally to film yourself on some kind of device, whether it's an iPad or a phone. Typically these days, use what I showed you last week, which were those little tripods with a clamp, or simply put it in front of you on a bookshelf or somewhere to stand it up. Now, when you listen to yourself back, if you are straining to hear yourself, the chances are that volume is too low. Now, that's using a device of some sort. Now, remember, volume is a function of distance. Now, if your phone is only a meter away, the chances are it'll sound quite loud. So simulate it in a real world environment. Put the phone about 4, 5, 6 meters away where typically the front row of your audience will be. Or if it's in a boardroom setting, the first couple of people, the first couple of rows next to you will be about 2 or 3 meters away. Or it's classroom style or theater style, it doesn't matter. Get that phone about approximately where the first person's set of ears will be. Now, when you speak, you will hear the volume played back off your phone at a much lower volume. Why? Because it's further away. Basic physics. Now, if that's the case, this is where you start to push your volume, start to practice that volume at a much higher volume from maybe typically what I hear is a 3 or a 4, push it right out to a 7 or 8. Now, that's using a device of some sort. If you have the environment at work or the office where you've got a couple couple of very good friends or trusted friends, colleagues, co-workers at work, then get them to give you some feedback. So ask them to please, if they've got 5 or 10 minutes, to sit in a room, maybe over lunch or after work or before you start, to sit down 2 or 3 meters away from you and you give some kind of presentation. It doesn't have to be a formal presentation, just how you got to work that day, or share a story of something you did over the weekend. What they're listening for is, how can I hear you? How well can I hear you? Just the volume. We'll get into the other stuff in a moment. So there's 2 ways you can check your volume. 1, listen to yourself back on a device. 2, get a trusted audience, friends or colleagues, to listen to you and allow them to give you honest feedback on how you sound. Can I hear you? So that's volume. And as I said here, we'll put that on a scale of 1 to 10. And typically you want to be aiming for about a level 7. And that would be a great volume for you to speak at in front of a group. Now, it is subjective, as I said earlier, but it's also environment and context driven. Let me explain that. So if you're in a small room and there's 5 or 6 people around a room and it's a well insulated room and there's no extra loud noises coming from next door or from street level, then you might very well get away with a 6 in terms of volume. But if you're in a large hotel and there's conference rooms all up and down the hallway, the corridor, and there's typically 3 or 4 conferences going on around you, in the room next door, the room opposite, and you've got catering staff or hospitality staff coming in and out with tea and coffee. The air conditioning is really loud if it's a warm country, or warm temperature, and or if the central heating is loud because there's air blowers. Doesn't matter. Or perhaps the window's open and somebody is mowing the lawn outside. That all contributes to noise pollution, in which case your 1 to 10, you should try and push that up to perhaps an 8. We can't always control the environment we're in, so try and control what you can, which is your own voice. Of course, if the opportunity is there to use a microphone and you've got speakers wired up in the room, that obviously helps. But if it's a meeting where it's just the volume of your own voice, which is unaided, not amplified, in a loud environment, push it up to an 8, I would suggest. If it's a quiet environment, then you may very well get away with a 6. So that's volume. Second, I would talk about, now, inflection is just a posh word, if you like, for all kinds of things. It's the intonation in your voice, the tonality, the peaks, the troughs, the highs, the lows. Inflection is the energy, the passion, the enthusiasm in your voice. Now, you might have the volume at 7, but you might be very flat. And unfortunately, a flat voice can be perceived as mundane. And dare I say it, frankly, boring. So if you've got a dull, flat, boring voice, then the chances are you will send your audience to sleep in some form or other. And that's unfortunate, because if you know your topic matter and your subject matter well, there's every reason that you should be able to push not only the volume, but also increase the enthusiasm, the passion, the energy, inflection, intonation, tonality in your voice, simply to keep that engagement high. As the presenter, as the speaker, it is your job to ensure that your audience is engaged in what you are saying. So yes, you can speak loudly, but is it flat and dull and boring? And one of the easiest ways to increase the interest and to increase the engagement, just to have a little bit more passion, energy in your voice. And that comes from inflection. So I'm just going to put here, so it's a key reminders: passion and energy. And I'm sure you've seen people in your own work context, or colleagues or friends, or maybe you've been to seminars where you've had really passionate, engaging, energetic speakers, and you've had the complete opposite, where they're dull, flat and boring, and frankly, you're just clock watching or going out to get a coffee as an excuse not to sit there. So number 1, make sure they can hear you. Number 2, inflection. Have some energy, passion in your voice. Number 3. So what do you think number 3 is? Well, number 3 is a 2-part, and I call it pace and pauses. Both are related. So pace is the speed at which the words are coming out of your mouth. In other words, how fast are you speaking? So for me, I'm around about 130-ish, 30, 40 words per minute right now. That's the pace that I'm speaking at. I am quite an energetic person, so I tend to speak potentially quite fast. But in this case, I'm tempering my speed down because this is a small tutorial about presentation skills. So for me, pace, when it's driven by context, as it is in this particular scenario, I need to slow my pace down to about 130 words a minute. If you speak too quickly, so push it up to maybe 180 words a minute, then I might speak this quickly. And for you, you may not understand what I'm saying because I'm talking too quickly. And before you know it, I'll get to the end of the sentence and you're thinking, whoa, what has he just said? That's too fast. And if you're delivering a 20, 30-minute presentation at that pace, you will have some bewildered looks on your audience faces, and they might be looking at each other thinking, what's he or she just said? What was that about? Now, the reason that's linked into pauses, could do a whole tutorial on pauses. Pauses are desperately important. It's because if you speak at a fast pace, maybe not 180 words a minute, maybe you're still at the border of sort of 150 plus words a minute, then one of the easiest ways to have the perception that you're speaking at a normal pace is by dropping in frequent pauses. Pauses are extremely powerful. They serve a number of different purposes. So if I'm pausing, it's helping me as the presenter. So from a very selfish perspective, if I pause, it helps me gather my next thoughts. It helps me breathe. That breathing, when I'm sucking air in, I cannot basically say anything. So it creates a space. It creates a silence. That silence is not only important for me to think about and start to formulate what I'm going to say next, it also helps me reoxygenate my brain by virtue of me breathing. And if my brain's been reoxygenated, that blood is pumping around, I can think more clearly, and then I can articulate what I need to say next much more clearly and much more deliberately. That's from a selfish perspective. However, there is also an enormous benefit, a huge benefit to your audience for you as a speaker when you pause. And that is, when you pause, your audience can then start to process and consider and think what you just said. It also gives them an opportunity to write something down, or these days perhaps type it on an iPad, before you move on to the next piece. So for your audience, pauses are really important. It just helps them assimilate and process what you've just said. If you're speaking too quickly, without pausing, and they are desperately trying to take notes, by the time they've written down their notes or considered or thought about what you've just said, you've moved on so fast that they've now lost where you are now because they were processing what you said previously. So pace, drop it down, 100, 120, 30, 40 words per minute, something along those lines, and pause frequently. For a selfish reason, to help you think more clearly and articulate what you need to say, take a breath, and for your audience to basically have enough time to process what you've just said, write stuff down, consider what you've just said. Perhaps they're going to ask a question at the end because they've now had time to consider what you've just said, and possibly write something down or type it. So pace and pauses, really, really important. I'll just do the pause sign because it's an easier way to remember that. Last but not least, again, you'll recall from last week, I touched on this, I'm going to go into a bit more detail here, is what I call non-words. Now, non-words, you've heard them all before, I'm sure. Things like basically, so, you know, like. Teenagers' favorite word these days seems to be the word like. It doesn't add value to what's being said. It doesn't add any quality to the sentence or the phrase that they're going to say or share, but it seems to be a very common one, like, so, basically, you know. Those are words that we find in the English dictionary, but they're put into a sentence, they're added to a phrase, not to add value, but simply because, in our experience, the speaker, the person who's talking or presenting at the front of the room, doesn't have the ability yet to pause or create silence or to have a gap. So what they tend to do is use the non-words as fillers in those spaces, which should really be silence. So non-words can be things like, you know, basically, so. Those are words that you can find in the English dictionary, but they can also be just basic grunting sounds like mm, You'll hear all of that. And I'm sure if you listen, actively listen to the next presenter or speaker that you watch, if you listen carefully, you'll hear them say a few non-words like ums and ers all the way through. Now, 1, 2, 3 ums and ahs, or 1 or 2, 3 non-words which are repeated frequently, it's not the end of the world. However, if they become very frequent and more dangerously, notable, that's when they become an irritation. In fact, a very quick story. I was sat in a seminar not too long ago, a couple of years ago, just after the pandemic, and I was watching a speaker, and somebody was umming and ahhing a lot. And the person next to me was so distracted, they sort of elbowed, I knew them, they sort of elbowed me in the ribs. I said, I can't listen to them. There's just umming and ahhing all the time. And they were actually counting down the number of ums and ahs. Now, when it gets to that level, that is a distraction because it's just now irritating. The content they were sharing was peppered with so many ums and ahs that it just completely diluted what they were saying. And not only did it dilute what they were saying, it was a distraction for my colleague, my friend. And then when they shoved an elbow in my ribs, it was a distraction for me. So all of a sudden, just having the ability to strip out the non-words or the buzzwords in some organizations means that the delivery of what's being said is much, much cleaner. Everything that's been shared is purposeful. It has a meaning, it's deliberate, and it's not shoved in with lots of ums and ers and So having fewer non-words or buzzwords is much more eloquent, it's much more deliberate, and when you articulate it well, what comes out of your mouth is much cleaner, and your audience are much more likely to understand it, comprehend it, and importantly, internalize it. So that's why these two are related. Pauses will help you eliminate the non-words or the buzzwords. So just by taking a breath, by breathing in, it's impossible to out. To make a grunting sound, you have to have air flowing out. So if you pause and breathe in, very difficult to out. So exercise, practice, rehearse your pauses, and that will eliminate the vast majority of non-words and buzzwords. So that's what we're listening to. Remember, what you see and what you hear, really important. What are your audience listening to? Very quickly then, make sure your volume is at a 7 or 8, depending on the context. Push it up. Get somebody to listen to you. Trust their feedback. If they're 2-3 meters away from you, it's going to be very valuable feedback. If you don't have somebody like that, use some kind of device, typically a phone these days. Put the phone 2, 3, 4 meters away from you. You will hear a huge difference in the volume. Volume important. If they can't hear you, there's no communication going on. Inflection. Have some energy, some passion in what you're saying. Have those peaks and troughs. Speed it up a little bit, slow it down. Pace. Drop in frequent pauses from a selfish perspective, as I've just said, and from your audience perspective to have time to think and process what you've just said. And last but certainly not least, non-words. Listen to what's coming out of your mouth from the recording. If you are struggling with non-words, start to breathe more deeply, more frequently, add the pauses. Silence really is golden, not only for you, but also for your audience. So that's what we're listening to. I really hope that's helped. If you have any questions at all, please put them in the comment box below. What we listen to and how we sound is hugely important when it comes to presentations. It's one of the fundamental skills of good speakers, good presenters. Remember, I heard this before, your throat, your voice box is a musical instrument. It can be manipulated in so many different ways. So when you have the opportunity to practice and rehearse, do so. Do so with energy and enthusiasm. Have that passion. Pause frequently, go up and down in pitch, tone, etc. And ensure that they can hear you and make sure you're not speaking too fast or frankly too slowly. This musical box here, this beautiful musical instrument is very, very powerful. I don't need to tell you there's so many singers and pop stars and opera singers out there. They earn a fortune from their voice. And they're able to manipulate it in such beautiful ways that we just hooked on it and we love to listen to it. Now, we don't have to go to that level, but certainly we don't have to be flat, dull, and boring. Practice, practice, practice. If you're saying too much, remember the phrase, less is more, and it really is. That's one of my favorite phrases, but less really is more. If you've got 20 slides, drop it down to 5 or 6. Speak less, share stories, and deliver them with passion, energy, and purpose. All right, I look forward to seeing you on the next video. If you've got any comments, please share. We all learn from each other in this community. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Take care, and bye for now.